please go back and listen to the overview of the testimony, because otherwise you may find yourself a little lost today as to what we're discussing and how the testimony works. So last week or 2 weeks ago, we did the overview of the testimony. We saw what it was, how it works, and just a very brief overcap. The testimony, which is referred to in Isaiah 8:16 and 8:20, is a law, an outline within both Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28 that prophesies of Israel's future. Because it is in the law that was handed to Moses at Mount Sinai, it was not only Yahovah's physical contract with the ancient nation of Israel, but it was also a law that defined all prophecy. So if any prophet is going to prophesy of the future at any point in time, he is going to use this law to base his prophecies. If he goes outside of this and he adds something to it, like Hananiah did in the book of Jeremiah, then you know that it is false, because it contradicts what is written in the law. So we are going to delve right in. I see, are the audio and video still working okay? I am watching at home on Facebook, and I am seeing a few interruptions in the video. If you guys have trouble, please let me know. That I might need to see what kids are using the bandwidth and kind of mention something to them. So anyways, we are going to delve right in. So let me go get my slideshow. All right, and I'm just going to wait for this to transition over. And these are the pages we will be using. So I'm just going to text my daughter real quick and let her know that we need the bandwidth. Okay, so this is chapter 15. We are skipping chapter 14 because I did do these about, I think, 6 or 9 months ago. So if you are missing chapter 14, please go back to YouTube. I am saving everything and uploading it to YouTube, and those chapters are there. So we begin with this section. The testimony begins with a time of blessing. This is going to be Deuteronomy 28, verses 1 through 14, and Leviticus 26, 1 through 13. Now remember, Leviticus was the covenant that Yahovah made with Israel at Mount Sinai. And then you have Deuteronomy as the covenant that Yahovah made with Israel after the 40 years in the wilderness on the plains of Moab. This covenant happens a couple days before Moses dies, and it occurs right before Israel is entering the promised land to claim the land of their inheritance. So you find that after Israel's 40 years in the wilderness, the covenant that's made with Israel in Deuteronomy 28 is much more detailed. It goes into much more in depth, mainly because Yahovah has seen Israel's history. He knows the heart of his people, and he can put some very specific consequences in there just by knowing what Israel is going to do by seeing their past. And that's what you see in Deuteronomy. So what we're going to see today is the incredible fidelity between Leviticus and Deuteronomy, how they say the exact same thing at the exact same time. So again, Deuteronomy begins with a time of blessing, and I want to encourage each of you on your own time, go through these texts, Deuteronomy 28, 1 through 14, and Leviticus 26, 1 through 13. Read them for yourselves. See how they overlap. Don't take my word for it, but prove it for yourself and see, and even look up the Hebrew words and see the incredible fidelity that you have. So what you have in this particular time of blessing, you basically have 70 years of blessing for Judah, this time of peace where there's no war, there's no evil occurrence. David has subjugated his enemies, and then Solomon has this 40-year reign of peace where there is no enemy, no evil occurrent, or anything like that. So this marks the ultimate culminating of the time of blessings. And really what you find is the testimony or the ultimate event that marks this time of blessing is the ability to build a tabernacle, a permanent residence for YHWH within the nation of Israel. This is significant in several points. First of all, it shows, and actually, I'm getting ahead of myself. We're going to hold off just a minute because I'm going to go ahead and stick with my narrative. I often get into the text because I love it so much and I get ahead of myself, but we're not going to do this. So right here is a summary that you're going to see of a synopsis of Deuteronomy 28, 1 through 14, and Leviticus 26, 1 through 13. So you find that the major points that YHWH says he's going to do, these are all the blessings that come. These are the consequences that come from following the covenant. They come from following this natural law of life. You find that rain is in due season. The land yields its increase. There is abundance. The threshing reaches into the vintage and the vintage into the sowing. This indicates that you will probably be able to plant 2 or 3 crops in one year, and you will be able to reap the harvest of those several times. You will have fruitful of offspring. Your children will be healthy. There won't be preterm labor. There will not be birth defects. You will not have disease. So YHWH establishes his covenant. Now you remember this idea of establishing a covenant. This was not just a one-time thing that occurred at Sinai or in the plains of Moab with Moses. You find that in Deuteronomy 31, YHWH establishes that Israel is to renew this covenant every 7 years. And what we see in Judah's history, the way this was done, is that during Sukkot, the covenant would be read before all of Israel. And at the reading, probably towards the end of Sukkot, towards the end of the feast, what would happen is all of Israel, the whole entire congregation, would stand to the covenants. That's what it states in the books of Kings. Israel would stand to the covenant. And by standing to the covenant, it was a vote basically by the congregation to not only renew the covenant, but also to pledge allegiance or to pledge adherence to that covenant for another 7 years. So this establishing the covenant was really an ongoing process that not only happened within every generation, but every 7 years. You also, again, point E, you will have surplus of the old harvest and of the new. And then this most important point, this YHWH setting his tabernacle among the people of Israel. This is important because this signifies Israel's military strength, her national independence, her physical autonomy. She is not being dictated to by other nations. She is able to do what she wants for herself. This would be even in contrast to the modern state of Israel, which does not yet have the power or the self-autonomy to be able to build a temple, to regulate that Temple Mount. Rather, it is still being regulated by foreigners within Israel's land. So Israel has not yet reached this type of blessing that they had during the days of David and Solomon. You also have this promise that YHWH will not abhor Israel, that he will love Israel. You find that all of Israel's bands have been broken. She walks uprightly. Israel is not dependent of other nations through debt. Rather, she becomes the lender and other nations become the borrowers. Now, it's very interesting because what we find historically right around say 1050 BCE all the way down to about 930 BCE, is you find that Assyria, it becomes very weak during this time. They're not capable of invading Israel. You also find that Egypt falls into this third intermediate period where they have constant civil strife. There's this power struggle between the priesthoods and the monarchy. And the kingdom breaks into 2 or 3 different regions at different points in time. And they are so focused on internal struggles that they really lose control over the land of Canaan, something that they had really controlled during the Judges era. So this really epitomizes the strength and the power of Israel that lasted for 70 years. Now I have right here in this slide shown, depicted, and this is in the book, this is in chapter 12, but I have shown you what the extent of David's kingdom was, David and Solomon, according to reconstruction within the scriptural record. So you find that they had Tipshan in the north all the way to Hamath. And if you look at Hamath, that was a very important city. It was a port, it was on the river, and it really controlled trade in the north. It was provided wealth for the entire land of Israel. And this was a key point that was often a point of contention between Judah and later Assyria. What's fascinating is that you find that even when the northern kingdoms rebelled, Hamath had been a Judite city. And even when the northern kingdoms rebelled, Judah maintained that port until about 100 or 200 years later, which we'll see as we go through the text. Judah did eventually lose it, first to Damascus and then to the Assyrians. The other thing that I have outlined, if you will look in the south, and I tried to put this in a colored outline, but I did not have time to work with it to figure out how to do that. So I'll work on that for upcoming classes. But you notice I have put Tamar in the south. Now, Tamar is an interesting point because it marked Judah's southernmost boundary before you get into the land of Edom. This fort was often fought over between Edom and Judah, but Judah did indeed hold on to this place for at least 250 years. And this is what, this is modern day Tamar. As many of you know, I went to Israel the 1st of November, and I had the privilege of excavating here. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but I am circling right here. This is the 11th century portion of the fort, or of the little complex here. And this would have been a Judges era, but probably more likely an Amorite era complex before it fell into Judah's hands. And then you have the portion here in yellow, which would have been King Solomon's fort, his Migdal, or an outpost where he would have had a garrison force. So this shows you the very large extent that David and then later Solomon were able to control under the blessings that the covenant afforded them. So anyways, it was a very large territory. So the culminating of the blessings were national independence, and you had obedience. So during this epoch of national blessings, Samuel and Saul began to subjugate the Canaanite region, while David establishes Israel's borders. He united the tribes and inaugurated a time of peace. Solomon's wealth increased abundantly as nations far and near brought their gifts and observed his wisdom. This indicates that Israel had a powerful enough army that they were able to levy tribute of other nations, probably the Philistines, the Edomites, the Moabites, and perhaps even some southern territories, probably Tyre, and maybe even Aram, which would have been Damascus, Syria, that area. All of those territories probably paid some sort of tribute to Israel, recognizing their superior military strength. So Israel became a holy people who were called in the name of YHWH, and they were feared. Again, this point of being feared is very important because it means you are not going to mess with Israel. Today, we don't really see that totally in the state of Israel. You have many nations who are still willing to mess with Israel, Iran being one of the chief offenders and the chief instigators in toying with Israel and threatening them. So, but anciently, no nation would have done this during the time of David and Solomon. You also have, this was the era where Israel became the head and the lender to many nations. They had no need to borrow. This whole idea of not borrowing is so important. When there's a text in Proverbs that states the borrower is slave to the lender. And this is not just true on an individual level, but it's also true on a national level. Because when you um, are a borrower, you are at the mercy of your lender. So that means your lender gets to dictate terms. If you need the money, say to buy grain so you can have crops so your people do not starve, that means that nation has control, authority, and power over you. They can dictate how much you're going to have to pay. They can dictate taxation. They can also dictate the fact that you reduce the number and size of your army. They can also confiscate some of your people to serve in their army as garrison forces or something of that example to that nature. The other thing that you have is that the crowning achievement of this era is really Yahweh setting his temple among Israel. And Shabbat Shalom to everyone who's just tuning in. I'm so glad to see you guys. It's great to have you with us. So the temple signifies Israel's closeness to Yahweh. This is again Deuteronomy 4 verses 4 through 8, where it states, "What nation is there on earth that has Yahweh so close to them?" But there was also this idea that it wasn't just a spiritual closeness to Yahweh. The spiritual always manifested itself physically. So the physical manifestation was this building that demonstrated that God was with the nation, that the people were walking in obedience to the covenant, and Israel's power and might and independence was shown because they were able to build this monumental palace for Yahweh. Had Israel been under the thumb of Egypt or Assyria, the money and the assets and resources used in constructing the temple would have been given to tribute to other nations, and they would not have been able to do this. So in many instances, as long as this structure stood, it really indicated Israel's autonomy, her independence. Even in the Second Temple era, even though Israel never had the closeness to God, Israel never followed the covenant, Israel never had the spirit of Yahweh or his presence dealing in the temple, even though they never had any of that during the Second Temple era, the building itself, though empty, still represented a sort of autonomy that the nation had and an independence that they had until that structure was remade by Herod. And then you find that it no longer really represented a true Judite independence, but rather because it was remade by Edom, it really became a tool that was almost yielded or welded against Israel as much as it stood for their independence. It really became more of an Edomite structure that then you find later was not only destroyed by the Romans and ceased to exist, but then you find other edifices were built on the Temple Mount that signified the power. It signified the control, the authority of other nations and their ability to control Israel and their influence ultimately on the world at large. So it becomes if you look at the Temple Mount on a chessboard as a pivotal piece that you are trying to control, definitely the Temple Mount is that central point of the board. So you find that after Solomon had covenanted with Yahweh, he turned from Yahweh. He had covenanted twice. Yahweh had given him his heart's desires, but yet that was not enough. Solomon's heart was led astray by his hundreds of wives, and he began to worship false deities. Because of this, Solomon brought on the curses. His defiance of Yahweh, his lack of recognition of the covenant, and his rebellion not just affected him, but affected the entire nation. You find in 1 Samuel 8, Samuel protests to Israel, and he tells Israel the type of nation that they will have. And he makes it very clear that many times Israel will be judged, not just for their own actions, but also for their actions of their monarchs. So what you find in Leviticus 26, verses 14 and 16, as well as Deuteronomy 28, verses 15 through 20, is an outline of the curses that YHWH will apply to Israel. Now, at this point in time, there is no specific delineation. They are not applied. This is a general summary. Think of it as an introductory paragraph that summarizes the thesis that says, if you do this and you continue in this, this is what is ultimately going to happen. So you find that the points outlined is that if Israel will not obey or listen, if Israel will not follow YHWH's judgments, and most of these judgments had to do with legal cases in establishing equity, establishing righteousness where there was not the oppression of the poor or the indigent, where those who were victims, their rights were heard, and the oppressor was not allowed to progress across the land and to go unhindered, but rather there was a stopgap measures put in place. And then here, if Israel will break YHWH's covenant, if Israel does all of these three things and fails to uphold the covenant in these three aspects, you find that all of their blessings are turned into curses. They're cursed in the field, they're cursed in the basket in the store, in the fruit of their bodies. So here you're going to start finding not only disease, but you're going to start finding preterm births. You're going to find birth defects. You're going to find that the crops and the herds are also affected by these diseases. You're going to find that they are cursed when they go to battle. And the ultimate purpose of all these curses is the ultimate dissolution of or dissolving of the covenant. They are destroyed off the land. They are destroyed as a nation, and the people will perish through war and death, through disease, death, and war. So the curses begin in 944 BCE when the kingdom divides. So one of the questions that when I was originally working through this material, one of the questions that I had was, why does God wait until 944 BCE? Why not when Solomon first rebels? Why does God not do it then? So there was actually an older prophecy that prevented YHWH from doing this during Solomon's time. And we're going to just look at a few of these verses. We're going to start in Genesis 49:10. And this is the older prophecy that prevented YHWH from doing placing these curses on Israel during the reign of Solomon. And the traditional, whether you look in the JPS Tanakh or the KJV or whatever translation you're using, you usually find that the word Shebet here is translated as scepter. And it states, the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet until Shiloh come, and to him shall the gathering of the people be. Well, the word Shebet here could also be translated tribes, and we're going to see this in just a minute. So let's read it with the word tribes. It says, the tribe shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet until Shiloh come, and to him shall the gathering of the people be. So notice the context of this and how accurately it fits the reign of Solomon. Shebet appears in Scripture 190 times. It is translated as tribes 80% of the time, or 152 times. It is translated scepter or rod 20% of the time, which are 38 times. And Shebet is translated as tribes 78 times from Genesis to Judges. It is translated as rod twice, and as scepter only in 49:10. So you find during Israel's first, say, 200, 300, 400 years on the land, the predominant usage of the word Shebet was tribes. So it becomes very likely that Shebet meant tribes. So if you take the context of what Jacob had prophesied for Judah, remember the context of Genesis 49:10 was specifically in the context of a blessing for Judah and his descendants. So Jacob is stating that the tribes will not depart from Judah until after Shiloh. So this prophecy, this blessing that was given to Judah, prevented YHWH from separating the tribes and taking them away from David during Solomon's lifetime. And you find that all the prophets uphold this. So you find in 1 Kings 11:11, wherefore Jehovah said to Solomon, for as much as you have done this, and you have not kept my covenant and my statutes which I commanded you, I will surely wring the kingdom from you, and I will give it to your servant. As you may remember, Jeroboam the first was a servant in the corvée labor. He was actually the taskmaster, if you will, or the general manager of all the corvée labor. That would have been the forced or compulsed labor, where Solomon had drawn from the Edomites, from the Moabites, the Philistines, and where people had been sold, probably many people even within Israel that were very poor and very indigent, likely found themselves as part of this corvée force. So if Jeroboam had offered them something that was more peaceful when Rehoboam came to the throne, they would have been more likely to have followed Jeroboam. So you find that also 1 Kings 11 verses 12 and 13 continues this prophecy, and it gives the reason now in verses 12 and 13 as to why Yahweh would not rend the kingdom out of Solomon's hand during Solomon's days. It says, notwithstanding, in your days I will not do it for David your father's sake, but I will rend it out of the hand of your son. Howbeit, I will not rend away all the kingdom, but will give one tribe to your son for David my servant's sake, and for Jerusalem's sake, which I have chosen. So you find that even though Solomon had rebelled against Jehovah's covenant, David had not. So you find that for David's sake, Jehovah continues to uphold the covenant that he had with David. So this really shows Jehovah's righteousness, where even when David and Solomon rebel, Jehovah still upholds his covenant and saves a remnant for Rehoboam to rule over in the next generation. Now, 2 Chronicles 21 verse 7 is a summary. And I think I have misspelled Jehoram here. I'm sorry for that. But referring to Jehoram, it says, howbeit Jehovah would not destroy the house of David because of the covenant that he had made with David, and as he has promised to give him a light and to his sons forever. So this idea of having a light, in chapter 3 and chapter 4, if you will recall, we went through some of the covenants of light. Yahovah made covenants of light with women in Israel at the Exodus. Penuah was one of the women, Shephrah and Penuah, whom Yahovah made covenants of light with. That means that they had a sure house. No matter what war came to Israel, their children, they would always have a remnant among their children who would give a light to their ancestry, a light to that person who had lived. For David, it really went beyond that, from not just having children, but for actually having eligible heirs that could sit upon the throne and administer the administration associated with the monarchy. Now, as we know, this covenant was eventually broken when the monarchy came to an end. And it was done because of David's descendants and their continual rebellion against the covenant. But as we go through this and we go through the curses, we will see that Jehovah extended the maximum amount of mercy that he possibly could to David's descendants. So anyway, so what you find is that Jehovah did not to take the tribes out of Solomon's hand during his lifetime, because the prophecies were in place that Shiloh would be a man of peace and that the tribes would not depart from Judah until after the reign of Shiloh. So again, you find that it occurs later on. Now, I wanted to bring back in the division of Leviticus. And this is really a cultic judgment. Leviticus is a judgment against the sanctuary. And what this means is that the Leviticus's 7 times are really only valid for as long as a tabernacle or temple exists within Israel. So I do in the book, I show how these 7 times judgments, how they worked during the Judges era. And at the end of those 7 times, you find that the tabernacle was destroyed during the days of Eli and Samuel. There is an intermediate period. There is kind of a regathering. There's a renewal, a point of righteousness in the land, where Yahweh again reconfirms his covenant, and he allows for another tabernacle, this time a permanent structure, to be built under the during the days of Solomon. But what you find during this time is that there are 5 specific 7 times periods, and these are 70 years that culminate in 350 years, during which the temple will stand. If Israel does not repent during these 350 years, then the ultimate judgment will be the total loss of autonomy, which is symbolized by the destruction of the temple. Let me go back. So this is the division of the 7 times for Israel and Judah. It says the 7 times judgment was applied when the tribes departed from Judah. The measuring line is first stretched over the northern kingdom, which never returns to the covenant. So this is very fascinating, because you find that the early curses are not really so pronounced on Judah. They are much more pronounced on Israel. You also find that Israel's sanctuary, the tabernacle that Jeroboam had erected for the 2 calves that represented Moses and Aaron, that brought Israel out of Egypt, you find this is destroyed before the temple is destroyed in Jerusalem. So you find that the 7 times is very specific in the points that it addresses. And it is very specific in the 7 times and the 70-year periods that are placed first on Israel and then later inherited by Judah. So you find that ultimately it is both Israel and Judah that are divorced from Yahweh and that are separated from his covenant and from the land. So the first set of 7 times, and now we're getting into the specifics. These are the curses that are now actually being applied to Israel in 944 BCE, and they will occur and continue to be applied in Israel all the way down to 874 BCE. So this would have been the first 70 years of curses. You find they're cursed in the field, in the fruit of the body, in their increase, and the sword. You find the kings during this period. For Samaria, it's going to be Jeroboam through Ahab. For Judah, it's going to be Jeroboam through Jehoshaphat. So these are going to be the kings during this very first 70 times period. And this is specifically what Deuteronomy and Leviticus prophesy. And I would like for you guys to notice the cogency of what is stated. Notice how incredibly accurate Deuteronomy and Leviticus state the exact same things. So in Deuteronomy it states, and Yahweh will smite you with a consumption and with a fever and with an inflammation and with an extreme burning and with the sword and with blasting and with mildew, and they shall pursue you until you perish. So this is Leviticus. This is the original prophecy that would have been given before Deuteronomy. Yahweh had originally stated at Sinai in his covenant, his contract with Israel. I will also do this to you if you rebel against my covenant, is the context. It says, I will appoint over you terror, the consumption, and the burning ague, and it shall consume the eyes and cause sorrow of heart. And you shall sow your seed in vain, for your enemies shall eat it. So notice how these texts are saying the exact same thing for the exact same time period in Israel's history. You find that sit upon, translated blight, it denotes a plant's disease or an injury that results in the withering, the cessation of growth, and the dying. Blight, which then you find that these 2 words, yerapon and sitapon, they always go hand in hand in the text. Even though they're 2 different types of plague against crops, you find that one is often caused by the other. So blight is often caused by pathogenic organisms such as bacteria and mildew that lead to infection. It could also be caused by parasites. A parasitic infection could also fit the description of blight. The testimony notes that Eurapon translated mildew or parasites such as fungi would ravage the bountiful harvest as Yahweh begins to reduce Israel's bounty. So now you find this vintage that at one point in time, when maybe you had two, at the most three harvests during a year, you find that the withering effects are going to begin to reduce the bounty. Your crops are going to take longer to mature, and you are going to have less that will actually produce because of the disease that is afflicted upon the crops. And notice again the similarity between Leviticus and Deuteronomy's testimonies for the hardships that are described during this era. So here are some of the specific curses. This is what they look like. Mildew is kind of this powdery substance that is on the plants. You have black spot that is on peppers. In the South, we see black spot all the time. I can't tell you how many crops that I have had that have fallen subject to black spot. And you also find that you have to resort to a lot of very harsh chemicals, and even those chemicals don't always save your crops. And it's very difficult to do it organically and to do it naturally. Blight, these are two different types of blight. This is a blight of tomatoes where you can see that the plants themselves are dying. In the lower right-hand corner, this is a blight of chickpeas that affects a chickpea crop. You can see how quickly it can ravage a crop, and how the numbers of what you are able to produce, say on an acre or several acres, are drastically reduced so that you have less produce to sell. And eventually it comes to the point where you barely have enough to as sustenance. Remember, it's in the surplus. Your first step is you are going to take care of your family. You're going to take care of your local community. And then when you have bounty, when you have that surplus that where your cup runs over, that's what you're going to sell to other nations. And that's where you're going to become very wealthy. Well, as these diseases of your land or of your crops begin to reduce your excess, you're going to become reduced financially, and you're going to become more poor and not have the bounty that you once did. So what evidence is there that mildew and blight occurred during the first 7 times curses? Well, Amos gives us that evidence. Amos lived around 820 BCE, and this is what he testifies. And he is referring to a previous time. He's referring to the past. He says, he states that YHWH had smitten you with blasting and mildew when your gardens and your vineyards and your fig trees and your olives trees increased, and the palmworm devoured them. And yet you have not returned to me, says YHWH. I have sent among you the pestilence after the manner of Egypt. Your young men I have slain with the sword, and I have taken away your horses. I have made them stink of your camps to come up to your nostrils. Yet you have not returned to me, says YHWH. I have overthrown some of you as the overthrow of Sodom and Gomorrah, and yet you were as a firebrand plucked out of the burning, and yet you have not returned to me. So we find, Amos is living in the second 7 times, and we find that even during that time period, Israel still had not returned to YHWH. So you find that another aspect is this idea of the burning argue. If Israel does not adhere to the covenant, you find there are natural consequences. Now, let me stress again, the covenant that YHWH made with Israel was not some magic formula. It wasn't some superstitious or mystical covenant. It was very much a very realistic law, a natural law, where YHWH took the very laws that govern our universe, the laws of physics, the laws of thermodynamics, the laws of entropy. He took all of these laws and he put them in a legal code that teaches us how to live, teaches us to have equity and harmony with our fellow man, to have equity and harmony with the land. All of these things that YHWH teaches us are statutes of life, as Ezekiel 33:15 states, that teaches us how to have life and how to have it abundantly. So one of the blessings that came from following the covenant was the fact that there would be no diseases in all of Israel. No congenital diseases, no diseases that occurred due to lifestyle, no diseases that you passed on genetically. Can you imagine going your whole entire life and never even having a fever? Well, this was what YHWH's promise. And this was the promise that was given to Israel by the waters of Meribah. And this promise was given as Israel came out of the land of Egypt. It says, and YHWH states, if you will diligently hearken to the voice of YHWH your God, and you will do that which is right in his sight, and will give ear to his commandments, and keep all his statutes, I will put none of these diseases on you, which I have brought on the Egyptians, for I am YHWH who heals you. Well, that is the blessing of adhering to the covenant. So the opposite of that is if you are going to ignore the covenant, you're going to eat pork, you're going to eat the animals that die of themselves, some of them may even be diseased, is that you are then going to have diseases that adhere to you and your children. So the word translated fever in Deuteronomy 28:22 is quadahat, and kor translated extreme burning in Leviticus 26:16, both denote an especially violent fever that results from various infections. It could be a virus, it could be bacterial. You find that you can have a fever from either types of disease. So we do have evidence of this occurring in Jeroboam's days. You don't find during the days of Samuel, of David, of Solomon, you don't find any scriptural accounts of people becoming sick. The first time that you find sickness recorded in scripture occurs when Jeroboam's son fell sick. If you may remember the story, Jeroboam's wife goes to the prophet Ahijah, and she goes disguised as someone else, and she asks if her son will live. Ahijah is not deceived. He knows exactly who she is, and he tells her, the moment you go into the city, your son is going to die. And you find from this scriptural account that that is what happened. So that is the first time. So we have crops. We have diseases and plague being placed on crops. We have diseases and plague being placed on Israel. But that's not the only curse that we find. We also find that the sword begins to fall on Israel. And this sword really comes at the hands within Israel and Judah. So this is a time of civil war, civil strife. But you also find that it comes from the other very localized kingdoms that had rival factions fighting over Israel's land. So these would be territory disputes and a question of who is going to have suzerainty, who is going to have the power over other tribes and other nations at this point in time. So you find that Israel is beginning to be cut short, and these are the evidence of it that we have during this first 7 time period. So for Israel, it states, so Ben-Hadad listened to King Asa and sent the captains of the host which he had against the cities of Israel. This would have been the northern kingdom. He smote Ehon, Dan, and Abel Betha Mahakah, and all of Kinnereth within the land of Naphtali. So again, this would affect Israel, not so much Judah. It says, and the children of Israel fled before Judah, and God delivered them into their hand, and Abijah and his people slew of them a great slaughter. So there fell down, slain of Israel, 500,000 chosen men. Thus the children of Israel were brought under at this time, and the children of Judah prevailed, because they relied on YHWH, the God of their fathers. And Abijah pursued after Jeroboam, and took his cities from him, Bethel with the towns thereof, and Jeshna with the towns thereof, and Ephraim with the towns thereof. So what you find during this time period is that it is the northern kingdom that is being cut short. So why do the curses fall first on Samaria? Actually, at this point in time, Samaria had not even been designated as a capital. But you find that it fell on Ephraim, the northern kingdom, simply because they had followed in the ways of Jeroboam, who taught Israel to sin, and they never once turned from those ways. They began to worship at the altars, and they forsake YHWH. And they began to participate in all sorts of cultic activities that were not only a source of idolatry, but they were physically harming to Israel, both as far as allowing disease into the congregation, as well as perverting very strong and healthy um, relationships that established a healthy psychology for the nation. So again, the curses fall on the northern kingdom first, and you find that for the first curse, it really does not fall on Judah to such a greater extent because they were walking in the way of Yahweh and they did not depart. While they may not have walked in the ways of Yahweh to the extent that David had, they still had not departed to the degree that the northern kingdoms had. So the first 7 times or 70 years from 944 to 874 of Israel are marked by walking contrary to Yahweh and his covenant. You had curses on crops, disease, and civil war. Yahweh would allow another 7 times or another 280 years for Israel to return from her sins before he divorced both Israel and Judah. What we find as we will go through these curses is that the prophets tell us. They say that Judah will inherit Samaria's plumb line. They will inherit this stick used for measuring sins that had once fallen on Ephraim. Judah will later inherit. And this is a very important point because you will hear in various religious discussions, even today, that Jehovah divorced Israel, but he never divorced Judah. Well, this really is a disservice to the text, because what you find from the text is that a nation is only considered, quote unquote, married to Jehovah as long as they are attached to the land. And it's not just being attached to the land, but it is really having Yahweh dwell among them and being in covenant, walking in the way of Yahweh. So when Yahweh gives Israel a bill of divorcement and he divorces them, it is because they are taken away from the land. When Yahweh gives Judah a bill of divorcement, it is because they are taken from the land. And then also you find that they are no longer married to Yahweh until that tabernacle or until that place of shelter that represents the autonomy of the nation and having Yahweh dwell among them is reestablished. So you find as long as that does not happen, the nation does not have that symbol of autonomy and closeness with Yahweh. So the final blow to Israel's independence and autonomy during both the first and second temple periods would be the loss of political power that is symbolized by the destruction of the temple. So this really is the synopsis for the first 70 years of Israel's dwelling on the land after Solomon departs and this fracturing of the kingdom in 944 when the tribes depart from Rehoboam. And you find that there was an earlier prophecy. Let me see if I can. Okay, I think I have transitioned back. I'm waiting for my video to catch up to what I am doing here. So, okay, there we go. So you find that this first 70 years had very specific curses that fell on Israel predominantly. Later, we will see that the curses do indeed fall on Judah. But notice how specific the testimony is. It isn't something that is just out there in a nebulous where there are unspecified curses. And you find that there is a direct cogency between Deuteronomy and between Leviticus. So what we're going to see in upcoming weeks is that every single deportation of both Judah as well as Israel was foretold in this testimony that was given to Moses on the plains of Moab, which means that something like 500-600 years before these deportations took place, Yahweh had prophesied and he had told Moses that these were going to happen. And we were going to see that some of these deportations are recorded in scripture, but then some of them are not. Some of them are only recorded in the Assyrian archive. So this becomes very, very interesting when you see how this plays out in Israel's history. So I thank you guys for joining me. If you have Any questions, please post them below. It is great spending Shabbat afternoon with you. Now, we will not be meeting next week. And actually, let me look at my calendar here. We will not be meeting again until the 16th. That will be our next time, and we will delve into chapter 16. Please go back, read the scriptures. Don't just take my word for it. Read it, study it out for yourselves, and see if you find this method convincing. See if you find it to be a valid way to address the testimony and to address prophecy. And as we see the events unfold that had been predetermined, not so much predetermined. And let me just address this really quick, because it wasn't so much that YHWH's actions or the events themselves were predetermined, as much as if Israel walked contrary to YHWH, well, then his judgments of Israel's rebellion were indeed predetermined. So if at any point in time Israel turned from their sins, they returned to YHWH, they could have avoided that next 70-year period of curses and consequences in their lives. So all it took was a Tu Shavah, a returning to the covenant, to avert further disaster and further curses. So we will continue this next week. I hope you have a wonderful evening and a great week. Thank you for being with me, and I will see you then. Shabbat Shalom.